The Sega Genesis is probably my all-time favorite console, as it was the first video game console I ever had as a kid, so I have a lot of fond memories with this library. So it's about time we talk about the top 30 co-op Sega Genesis games. Biohazard Battle is a horizontal shoot-'em-up. Of course, you could play it in 2-player co-op, and it's a pretty solid game. You got your standard power-ups, and you also have a little turret around you that is able to double your firepower. This game has some really great visuals, especially some of the boss fights. The only part that I don't love is some of the music sounds like that tinny Genesis sound that a lot of people kind of make fun of. It's still a pretty solid side-scrolling shoot-'em-up. Blades of Vengeance. It's a game that I did not even know existed until I was an adult. It's kind of like Golden Axe if it was a side-scrolling platformer. You could choose between 3 different characters: a warrior, a female warrior, I guess, or the mage. I've never been able to beat this game as it gets pretty difficult pretty quick. There's lots of secret pathways that you can take, so that really makes you want to just explore every nook and cranny of this environment. The main downside to me is just the platforming. It's not very good. But overall, Blades of Vengeance is a lesser known Genesis title. It's worth checking out. Crackdown is a top-down run-and-gun shooter. You could play in split-screen co-op. What makes it stand out from other shooters, it's not just straightforward combat. You can lean up against the wall to avoid enemy fire, and there's also a bit of strategy involved. The main objective is to disarm the bombs in level, and the fact that you could play it in split-screen co-op and split up the tasks and take on the enemies together is definitely an added bonus. Skeleton Krew is another top-down shooter, but this one's in an isometric view. This game is very difficult as well, and the controls take a bit of getting used to, but once you master the aiming and strafing function, it feels pretty good. But it definitely would have benefited from some twin stick controls. That being said, I really like the visuals here, the characters are interesting, and the boss battles are huge and colorful. I feel like the soundtrack for this game is really underrated. It doesn't sound like typical video game music, it's just very slow and atmospheric, which definitely fits the vibe of this game. Definitely check out Skeleton Krew. The Adventures of Batman and Robin is one of the Genesis games that I used to rent all the time when I was a kid. It's a run-and-gun platform shooter, and it looks and plays really well. You have an unlimited supply of batarangs with some power-ups. You can also jump and grab onto ledges and swing and kick the enemies, which can definitely be helpful in combat. The main downside to this game is it's way too long. I've never been able to complete it without cheat codes, and even with cheat codes, there's just not enough variety. It gets very tedious and repetitive. So if they would have just shortened it up and made it just a tighter game, it could have been a top tier Genesis game, but it's still worth trying out. The Punisher is another side-scrolling beat-em-up based off of a comic book. And this one's really great. You play as the Punisher as well as Nick Fury, and it's a port of the Capcom arcade game. It might not be as good as the original arcade game, but it's still definitely worth trying. The combat's solid. The main thing that makes it stand out is that you have guns. Unfortunately, you don't have access to them at all times. It's usually just set sections, but this definitely changes things up a bit and makes it a little bit more interesting. Cadash is a port of the arcade game, and this one's pretty unique. On its surface, it kind of looks just like a side-scrolling action platformer, but there are some RPG elements, as well as some exploration and power-ups, so this could really be one of the earlier examples of a Metroidvania. Unfortunately for the Genesis version, they cut down the character roster, so instead of having 4 characters, you're down to 2, which is just the fighter and the mage. Which is kind of unfortunate because the characters that I enjoyed playing with the most were the priestess and the ninja. Nonetheless, it's still definitely worthwhile. General Chaos is a multiplayer strategy game. I played this game for countless hours with my cousins growing up. If you have the correct adapter, you can actually play this in 4-player, which becomes really fun to do 2-on-2 battles with your friends. You can also play through the campaign in 2-player co-op. It's always fun putting together the best team to take on the enemies. The only downside to this game is the more action you see on the screen really slows things down, so that can be a little bit frustrating. Mystic Fighter is a side-scrolling beat-em-up where you play as 2 kabuki warriors. At first, the controls for this might feel a little loose, and it might not really look like one of the best beat-em-ups, but once you get the hang of the controls, it's actually a really fun experience. Especially when you can grab the enemies and spin them around and toss them off the screen. That's just satisfying. So to me, Mystic Fighter is one of the better co-op beat-em-ups on the Genesis. Jurassic Park Lost World is another top-down shooter, and this one has a lot of exploration. I had no idea this game existed until fairly recently, and I think it's a really good game. It's basically what you would expect in a Jurassic Park video game. You're 2 humans and you run around and you shoot dinosaurs. One of my favorite aspects is getting into the Jeep, where one player can drive and the other player can shoot. So that's a good co-op experience right there. This game gets very difficult as well, but this is one of the lesser known co-op games on the Genesis, so try it out. Bimini Run came out in 1990. It's a third-person shooter vehicle combat game, and you're in a speedboat. This is another really unique co-op experience. One player controls the boat and the other takes care of all of the aiming and shooting. In this game you have specific objectives, and you can pull up your map to see where the next target is. Unfortunately, a lot of the environment looks pretty similar, so it's pretty easy to get turned around or lost. So you're gonna need to pull up that map a lot. But this is one of those games that I think is underappreciated. Captain America and the Avengers is another one that I used to play a lot as a kid with my sister. We used to rent this game. We typically played as Vision and Iron Man. It's a side-scrolling beat-em-up, but you have lots of projectiles. This is a game that has, I think, a pretty good balance of difficulty. It's never too difficult. You're able to beat it in one sitting without too much of a challenge. It's definitely one of the better superhero games in the 16-bit era, but the arcade version is definitely a step up, as you could play it in 4-player. But the Genesis version is a lot better than the Super Nintendo version. Zero Tolerance is somewhat of a Doom clone. It's a first-person shooter, which in and of itself is impressive to see on the Genesis, even though you do have a pretty small window to view your character. That's okay. One of the coolest features is that you could play it through a system link. So if you have 2 Sega Genesis consoles and 2 copies of Zero Tolerance, as well as the link cable, you can play this in 2-player co-op. But you will need 2 televisions, so it's a little bit difficult to get this set up. I can imagine not many people did this back in the day, but if you have the opportunity, this is just a really cool experience, and it's a fairly solid first-person shooter, especially for the hardware. The next game I want to talk about is called Body Count. This came out in 1994. It's a light gun shooter that came out exclusively for the Sega channel in the US. It did have a physical release in Europe though. This game has some really nice visuals, and it's one of the few games that takes advantage of the Menacer light gun. But you can also use the Sega Genesis mouse, so that makes for a pretty interesting experience. One player could use the mouse and the other could use a light gun. To me, this is one of the better light gun games on the Genesis, that not enough people talk about. The Road Rash series is known for the mixture of racing as well as combat. My favorite of the Genesis games is Road Rash 3. It's fun to be able to pick up weapons and take out the motor vehicles that drive by you. You can play through the campaign in split-screen co-op. You're not necessarily working together in a cooperative manner, but if one of you places in the race, you both do move forward, and you're able to upgrade your vehicles along the way. I'm not a big fan of racing games, so this is definitely one of my favorites. Forgotten World is another side-scrolling shoot-em-up, but this one is pretty unique. You fly around as these muscular, shirtless men, and of course attack all the enemies. But what makes it stand out is you have this rotating turret that goes around you. So it takes a little bit of getting used to with the controls, but once you figure it out, it's really satisfying to double up your firepower and figure out the best formation for shooting the enemies. There's plenty of shops where you can stop to power up your characters as well. Forgotten World is an excellent shoot-em-up, which is made even better with co-op. Obviously. The Lost Vikings is not a Sega Genesis exclusive, but it does have a exclusive feature where you could play the game in 3-player co-op. So that makes the Genesis version the best way of experiencing this game. It's a side-scrolling puzzle platformer, and when you play it in 3-player, you each take control of your own Viking, and each of them have their own unique abilities. You'll have to work together to get through all the puzzles and get to the exit. This is a really great co-op experience, especially with 3 players. Arcus Odyssey is a dungeon crawler that can be played in co-op. It's kind of like Gauntlet, but it has more of an anime style. I really love the visuals here. This is another game that doesn't get a lot of attention. I totally missed this one when I was a kid. It recently came to my attention a few years ago. The game has its flaws, but I think it's a really solid co-op experience, and I'm always looking for more top-down action RPG style games. Double Dragon Battletoads is an excellent beat-em-up that combines 2 of the most popular beat-em-up franchises into one, Double Dragon and Battletoads, and it's actually one of the best games in both of those series. This was also released on the NES and the Super Nintendo, but I grew up playing the Genesis version, so that's why I wanted to include it. It actually plays more like a Battletoads game than a Double Dragon game. It has the same similar humor. When you're fighting the female enemies, you grab them by the hair and whip them around, and then you can like pound the guys into the ground. And it has a speed bike level as well. I love this game, but it does get very difficult very quick. But I still think it's a really great beat 'em up. Devilish is a game that could be best described as a breakout clone mixed with a dungeon crawler. And that might sound pretty weird, but let me explain. You have a ball that bounces around and destroys all of the enemies in sight. Each player takes control of a paddle. One will be primarily the defense paddle on the bottom of the screen, and the other one will maneuver around the rest of the environment. And every level you switch roles, so one player is never just stuck being the defense paddle. This is a game that I just bought on a whim when I was a teenager. I saw it at a local pawn shop and it looked interesting. Let me tell you, this is definitely one of the better co-op hidden gems on the Genesis. It's just such a unique experience and totally worth playing as a co-op game, especially for the really cool boss fights. Golden Axe is considered to be one of the all-time classic side-scrolling beat-em-ups, and that's for good reason. It has a really great soundtrack. The combat is really solid, and the characters are memorable. You can play as the dwarf, the warrior, or the female warrior. I don't really know what the term is for this. What do you call her? I don't know. She's a warrior, right? Each with slightly different stats and abilities. But one of the things that make this game stand out the most is that you can cast spells where you can do screen clearing special attacks. This is one of those games. Once you get into the rhythm of it, it becomes very satisfying. And once you get better at the game, you could pretty easily beat it in one sitting. Zombies Ate My Neighbors is another top-down run-and-gun shooter, but this one definitely stands out with its horror theme. You play as these 2 kids, which are the most 90s looking kids ever, and you gather various power-ups and take out all of the various horror-themed enemies. The objective of the game is to save as many humans as you can, and then move on to the next level. This is another one that's just very difficult, and I've yet to be able to beat it, but it's still one of my favorite co-op games on the Genesis. And one of the cool features about the Genesis version as opposed to the Super Nintendo version is that you get the map always on screen, so that will help you out a bit. Alien Storm is another side-scrolling beat-em-up, but this time, you're going to be fighting aliens. But the gameplay changes up quite a bit here. This one was created by the same team that did Golden Axe. Again, the controls might be a little bit weird at first, but once you get the hang of it, it feels really good. You also have these auto-scrolling levels where your characters are running, and then you have on-rail shooter sections. So that's what I really love about this game, is it never gets boring. You can beat the whole game in probably 30 minutes. It has just the right amount of challenge to make it a satisfying experience. Rolling Thunder 2 is a side-scrolling run-and-gun platformer, but what makes this game stand out is that you can jump to various levels, as well as go in through doors. So this adds a little bit of strategy to the gameplay. The sequel added co-op, which is obviously why we're talking about it, and the Genesis version is a really great port of the arcade game, and it even added a few extra levels. This one's not necessarily a hidden gem, but it's a game that I don't hear mentioned very often when you talk about co-op Sega Genesis games. And that's a shame because it is a really great game. World of Illusion, starring Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, is another one of my childhood favorites. It's a 2D platformer that was really just made for co-op gameplay. You gotta work together to get through the levels. Sometimes it's to catapult your friend up to a higher platform so then they can drop a rope down and pull you up. And then there's other parts where Donald will get his butt stuck in the crawl space and Mickey has to pull him through. To me, this is one of the best co-op platformers of all time, and the variety of levels make it always interesting. This is another one of those games that is just the perfect length and perfect difficulty. You could pretty easily pick it up and beat it in one quick session that won't take you longer than probably 40 minutes. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Hyperstone Heist is the Sega Genesis equivalent to Turtles in Time, but it has its own unique levels. Me personally, I prefer this over Turtles in Time. This is truly one of the best beat 'em ups of all time. The graphics are great, the music's really great. Just listen to this song. But most importantly, the gameplay just feels really satisfying. And I love that they assigned the dash to a specific button. It just makes it a more seamless experience. If you grew up playing Turtles in Time but didn't really think about Hyperstone Heist, now is the time to try it out. You won't regret it. Contra Hardcore is a Sega Genesis exclusive, and to me this is my favorite of the Contra series. The Super Nintendo had the Alien Wars, which is also a really great game, but I kind of prefer this one. First, you get to choose between various characters. That's a nice bonus, but also just all of the levels have this really nice dark atmosphere that just really fits the vibe of the Contra games. Like most Contra games, this is an incredibly difficult game, but if you get a good co-op partner, each level that you beat is definitely going to be very rewarding. So I gotta put Contra Hardcore high up on this list. It's definitely one of the best co-op games on the Genesis. Toejam Earl is another one of my favorite childhood video games. And to me, I think it's one of the best co-op games of all time. It's just a very unique experience. And it's definitely an early example of a roguelite. You have randomized levels as well as randomized items. The objective is to just find the ship pieces of each level, and once you gather those all up, you can complete the game. But every time you play the game, the levels are different, as they are procedurally generated. But what makes this game unique is that it's mostly a defensive experience. You don't really need to fight the enemies at all, you mostly just want to avoid them. And the majority of the items you pick up are just to help you defend yourself. You get high tops so you can run away from the enemies. You get wings so you can fly away from them. There are really only a few weapons that you can actually get. So that just really makes this game stand out. But the best feature is the co-op gameplay. This might be the earliest example of a dynamic split screen, and it works really well. If you're together, you're on one screen, and if you separate, the screen switches to split screen. And this makes exploring and looking for those ship pieces and presents a lot more manageable when you can split up and cover more ground. And of course, we gotta talk about the music. Just listen to this. Anyway, I can't say enough about Toejam Earl. It's one of my favorite games of all time. When it comes to run and gun platformers, I don't think many games can really compete with Gunstar Heroes. It's like Contra, but even more intense. When starting the game, the player can choose between either a free or fixed firing stance. The fixed stance makes it so you can't move and shoot at the same time, with the benefit being it's easier to aim, but you're not going to be able to avoid the enemies as easily, while the free stance makes it so you can run and shoot around freely. So it's nice to be able to have that choice. But one of the coolest features is that you can pick up various weapons and combine them with other ones to create unique combo attacks. The gameplay also changes up a bit. You have platforming, you have incredible huge boss fights, but you also have these parts where you're in a minecart and you're moving between the ceiling and the ground. There's a lot of creativity here in the level design, and this is another one with a really great soundtrack. To me, Gunstar Heroes is my personal favorite run-and-gun platformer of all time, and is truly one of the best co-op games ever. Before I get to number 1, I wanted to talk about some new games that came out for the Sega Genesis that have co-op. The first one is called Astebros, and this is made by the same creators that made Demons of Astebros, which is another great homebrew game for the Genesis. This is a co-op roguelite with some really great visuals and gameplay. And then we had Xenocrisis, which is a top-down twin-stick shoot-'em-up, similar to Smash TV. This game has been ported to a bunch of retro consoles from the Super Nintendo, the Dreamcast, to the Neo Geo, but it first came out on the Sega Genesis. And this game is just really impressive, visually and musically. I mean, listen to this music. It's one of my favorite soundtracks on the Genesis. It has really clear voice samples as well. And the last game I wanted to mention before we get to number 1 is called Paprium. This is a really great beat 'em up. Definitely one of the best beat 'em ups on the Genesis. It's incredibly impressive that they were able to get these visuals on this hardware as well. It looks really beautiful, and this game just has a lot of details. It has branching paths, so you can play through it multiple times and have a different experience. The combat feels good, the soundtrack is really solid. Everything about this, it's truly one of the best beat 'em ups on the Genesis. You can only play it on the Genesis as of right now, and you have to have the physical cartridge. So if you're able to do that, definitely try it out. Now we finally made it to number 1, and of course, it has to be Streets of Rage 2. That might not be a surprise to many people, as it's still considered to be the best beat 'em up of all time, and that's for good reason. It just got everything right, from the combat, to the graphics, to the character selection, to the boss fights, and to the incredible soundtrack by Yuzo Koshiro. Just listen to these beats. It's incredible that over 30 years later, people are still talking about this game as one of the best beat 'em ups. And not many games can really compete with it. Just everything about it feels right. You got the grab maneuver, so you can either punch your enemies or throw them, which is a really great strategy when you have a ledge and you can want to just throw the enemies off the edge. You also have the desperation moves, and each character's is different. This is incredibly helpful when you're surrounded by enemies or if you get grabbed and you want to break free. The difficulty is just perfectly balanced. If you have a skilled partner, you could pretty easily get through the whole game in one sitting. I just can't say enough about Streets of Rage 2. It's one of the best beat 'em ups of all time, but also just probably one of the best video games ever made. It's definitely my favorite. That's why I have to put it at the number 1 spot. So there you go. There are 30 co-op Sega Genesis games. What games did we miss? And if you enjoyed this video, check out our video where we talked about our top 30 co-op NES games. Thank you for watching.